A beloved healthcare worker is viciously attacked in her home.
We got a female down, blood all over the place.
I've never seen anything this brutal before. Severe head trauma, multiple stab wounds.
Her daughter is the only witness.
She mentioned something about an intruder, somebody broke in.
She's completely catatonic. She has no touch with reality at all.
Is she gonna be okay?
An investigation reveals the cracks in a loving relationship.
It was almost like sisters, that they just really got along.
Did you notice any, change in her mood?
I could tell she was getting more upset.
The evidence points to a suspect who is desperate to hide the truth.
She was really trying to keep up this facade that everything in her world was okay.
It was the problem that had built up, and finally came to a head when the truth came out.
On March 3rd, 2020, police in Akron, Ohio receive an alarming call from a nearby university.
The callers were from the University of Mount Union in Alliance, Ohio. It's about 40 minutes from here. And they were calling because they were in the middle of a conversation with somebody named Brenda Powell in reference to Brenda's daughter, Sydney Powell, who was a student at Mount Union, and the conversation got interrupted in a strange way. They reported that they heard a bunch of strange noises they described as a couple loud thuds, screams, and then some other, just unusual sounds, and then the phone went dead. They tried to call back, and they didn't get an answer. They were concerned that something had happened to Brenda. They wanted us we the police, to go out and just check, making sure everything's okay. When the officers arrived, they went to the front door.
I can hear her screaming in there. Front door's locked.
Officer Legacy went around towards the rear of the house, and he had noticed that one of the rear windows had been broken, and there appeared to be some blood around it. There was a sliding glass patio door, and he had observed that had also been broken in.
Akron Police!
And then there was some blood, looked like some blood smears there.
Akron Police!
And that's where he made entry.
Inside, the officer finds a young woman covered in blood.
Where's your mom at?
No, there's so much blood. No, please! Mom! She's going now!
She says she's Brenda's daughter, Sydney Powell.
Sydney is just hysterical. She's preventing the officers from going down the hallway. She mentioned something about an intruder, somebody broke in. So they really don't know what they're dealing with. She did say that her mom was bleeding, so they went to check it out. Officer Legacy made the discovery that Brenda was on the floor in the bedroom, surrounded by a massive amount of blood.
Brenda is bleeding from multiple wounds to her head and neck. So the officer immediately calls for emergency services.
Sorry, Smart, you just got crashed. A little over.
As officers rush to provide Brenda with life-saving care, Sydney is inconsolable.
She was very emotional.
Come on.
Screaming. So their first action was to remove Sydney from the interior of the scene.
Come on.
Is she gonna be okay?
Come on. Come on. You just need to cooperate with me, all right?
I want my dad.
Huh?
I want my dad.
What happened? What's going on? What's going on?
We heard a bang. We heard a bang. And she told me to get out. And then I heard screaming. So I came back and she was on the ground.
Okay, you heard a
I ran
bang.
out back. There was a bang. Broken.
The police are trying to determine what's going on. They see Sydney covered in blood. They don't know if there is an intruder that's gone, an intruder still on scene. In the house, police are pretty shocked to find that Brenda is still alive, considering the amount of blood on scene. So they try and do anything at all to stop the bleeding, to keep her alive as long as possible.
Brenda Doyle was born on March 19, 1969 in Salem, Ohio. She was a high achiever from an early age, excelling in Catholic school and going on to graduate from the University of Akron with honors.
She had her degree in early childhood education. She then proceeded to work at Akron Children's Hospital as a child life specialist. When she started there, she was dealing basically with adolescents and children that dealt with cancer or blood disorders. I met Brenda in 1995 through some mutual friends. This was a setup. We went on our first date as a group of us. Her smile is what really attracted me to her the first time. She just had that little snarky, sarcastic-looking little smile on her face that she just always seemed happy.
27-year-old Brenda was equally sure-footed in her relationship. She and 30-year-old Steve Powell married in 1996, just a year after their first date together.
We couldn't really make a decision on who wasn't going to be in the wedding, so I think we put all of our friends in. I had 7 groomsmen and she had 7 bridesmaids, so it was a large, fun wedding.
Brenda and Steve went on to have 2 children together. Their daughter Sydney was born in 2000, and 3 years later, they had a son. For the next 2 decades, Brenda split her time between work and family.
Brenda had one of the most difficult jobs I could ever imagine. She had to sit with families and talk to them about a cancer diagnosis, about chemotherapy, with kids who were going through the worst time in their life. Brenda was amazing. She was loved universally by everyone that she worked with.
Brenda's personality as a mother was very nurturing. I think from all those years of being at the hospital and dealing with the children that were there, I think she just did all she could to protect her child and did everything to make sure that, they grew up healthy.
Brenda and Sydney were especially close.
It was almost like sisters that they just really got along. Sydney was the mini-me of Brenda. I mean, they had the same personalities.
I remember her and her mom were always texting. I think Sydney really did look up to her mom, wanted to be how Brenda was. Be there to help people, to always put others first.
Sydney appeared to share her mother's drive and ambition as well.
Sydney's grades always were good, and all throughout elementary school and high school, she did a little bit of everything sports-wise and ended up really settling in on soccer, which she excelled at.
We were teammates. Sydney was a ball of fire. She was very small, but on the field, she was, one of our best players. So we always looked up to her, as a role model or as someone who would set an example on the field.
Sydney's high school academic career was impressive enough to earn her a presidential scholarship to the University of Mount Union. She moved into campus housing in the fall of 2018, but maintained frequent contact with her family.
Sydney was very excited to go to college. I think she was ready to spread her wings a little bit and go out there. She was going to get into something sports, physical fitness, training related. Then she eventually switched out of that to psychiatry.
By her sophomore year, Sydney seemed to be flourishing, and her relationship with her mother was closer than ever.
Mount Union is approximately 40 minutes from where we live. She would come home sporadically on the weekends since it was so close. If Sydney had a concern, Brenda would be the first one she would talk to. They really talked, and they got along.
But now, the mother and daughter have been involved in a vicious attack, leaving Brenda clinging to life and Sydney traumatized.
Are you cut?
I don't think so.
Yeah, you're cut somewhere.
I don't think so.
Yeah, your hand.
No, I was helping her. I grabbed her.
All right, stop. I'll tell you what, can you sit on the ground here real quick?
While first responders tend to Sydney and Brenda, her father, Steve Powell, races home.
I got a call from my friend, who happens to be a police officer, heard a call go out with my address. Sydney was down by the mailbox when I got it home, and she was almost shaking. I had no idea what was going on.
Coming up, a witness's erratic behavior perplexes officers.
No, she's not acting right.
And when tragedy strikes, detectives must grapple with a harsh reality.
I'm sure at that point I ended up going into shock. And then after that, it's pretty much a blur.
"50-year-old Brenda Powell is in critical condition after she was attacked during an apparent break-in. Her husband, Steve Powell, has just arrived home to find his daughter Sydney in a state of shock.
What's going on? What's this guy at?
The dad,
Okay,
Sydney. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Daddy!
Where's my wife?
The window's broken, Dad!
Where?
The back window's broken in!
So you're gonna have to
Daddy!
inside there? So.
I don't know! She was there with so much blood!
I tried to go up into the house, and I made it basically as far into the front room as I could, and then they proceeded to escort me out of the house.
You need to go outside, sir.
No, I don't.
Yes, you do. Outside. Back to the right. All the way back to the right. You need to stay outside. Go ahead. Please have a seat.
I don't want to.
Okay.
As paramedics continue treating both women, officers cordon off the crime scene.
My friend got there, and they took me back to his car. Very frustrating to not have any information what was going on, where your daughter's laying down by the mailbox and you don't know where your wife is.
Now, Brenda didn't look good. However, one of the paramedics was able to find a faint pulse. So based on that, they rushed her to the hospital.
Sydney is completely experiencing a psychotic break. She's completely catatonic. She continues to mumble kind of nonsensically.
She's likely going in and out of things, and she sees this evidence of a terrible crime around her.
Sydney. 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 What's going on with Sydney? What's going on? Huh? I need to know what's going on.
She was just laying there shaking and clawing the street, wasn't mumbling, wasn't saying anything.
Something definitely was not right. It was not normal behavior.
She's just not acting right?
No, she's not acting right.
All right. What was she involved with? What is this?
Well, we don't know.
We couldn't really determine at the scene what exactly her injuries were, but one of the paramedics crews looked at her and they ended up taking her to a hospital to get examined.
An officer escorts Sydney, hoping to gain more information. With Brenda and Sydney both on the way to the emergency room, investigators begin searching the house for evidence.
When I arrived, I met with Officer Legacy, and he kind of took me through the path that he took through the house. We were just trying to figure out, okay, what are we dealing with? We know Sydney was screaming about somebody breaking in, but besides the bedroom and the broken windows, there was nothing out of place. I didn't see any signs of any struggle or anything like that inside the kitchen. And then he took me down the hallway that separates the kitchen and the bedroom. He was pointing out different blood smears, appear to be blood smears on both sides of the wall. I just remember turning the corner, looking into the bedroom, and just seeing all that blood. It's one of the worst scenes I've been to. There was an iron skillet that was on the floor near to where Brenda was, and also a knife. It looked like to us that these might have been the possible weapons that were used.
In addition to the weapons, detectives also find the cell phone Brenda was using when she was attacked.
We're thinking, what happened? Are we dealing with somebody that broke in and attacked them for a burglary type situation? What about Sydney? Was Sydney involved in this? Does she have any information?
It's about an 8 or 9 minute drive to the hospital. The police officers trying to figure out what's going on, asking Sydney some basic questions.
What are you saying, Sydney? Huh? What are you saying?
She's not making any sense. She has no touch with reality at all. From the ambulance, Sydney's then taken to the psychiatric ward.
As Sydney is interacting with officers and her dad, something that we hear her say over and over again is, "Get out of the house, get out of the house." The police obviously don't know if she's a victim too. She is clearly in a state of shock.
And she really wasn't focusing on the detectives. She really wasn't acknowledging that they were even present, so we decided not to ask her any more questions at that point. We needed more information. Sydney wasn't going to be able to tell us anything. We're going to have to figure out other ways about what happened.
In the emergency room, doctors are doing everything they can to save Brenda Powell's life. Her 19-year-old daughter, Sydney, is being treated for wounds of her own. But she's still unable to tell anyone what happened. Investigators hope Brenda's husband, Steve, can provide some insight.
When they finally took me to the police station, they basically took a statement on what transpired up until the time that I got there. Any communication I had with Brenda or Sydney up until that moment.
Where'd you get a call from? What happened? Got a call from him, call from me.
He said there was a call, went out, a distress call from the University of Mount Union where my daughter was going, and said, female in distress. I said, well, that's funny because Brenda's there, my wife.
Steve says the day began like any other. He and Brenda had breakfast, then both headed into work. Sydney was scheduled to visit that weekend for spring break, which reminded Steve to pay her tuition for the following semester.
I sign on, it says, your login or password ID doesn't work. I'm like, well, that's weird, so I recover my password, and I put in the right answer, and it didn't work. So I sent Mount Union Billy an email and says, basically, what's wrong? So she called me back today and says, well, the reason you can't get on, long story short, is your daughter's unenrolled.
The university informed Steve that due to poor grades, his daughter had been academically suspended 2 months earlier.
So I text Sydney, I'm like, oh, give me a call. I have a question to ask you. I call her, no answer.
Steve and Brenda had installed Life 360 on their phone, so they could see where Sydney was at all times. So Steve sees on his phone that his daughter's home. He thinks to himself, why is she home?
I go home, and there she is. She's at home. Perfectly normal. She's crying because I buzzed her. I said, what's going on? Are you not going to school? She goes, I'm overwhelmed in school, and I don't really like what I'm doing, and it seems like it's a waste of my time and your money.
And me shocked. Since the winter quarter ended, she wasn't even enrolled, and they never knew about it. Steve called Brenda and made Brenda aware of what's going on, and he decides to go back to work. Now, the mom, Brenda Powell's coming home because she obviously wants to know what's going on as well.
According to Steve, he received a call from Brenda at 11:49 a.m. to let him know she was pulling into the driveway. An hour later, he received the call from a friend in law enforcement that officers had been sent to his address.
So I called Brenda. And it rings on the cell phone. No answer. I call Brenda back. Ring. No answer. I'm pacing around. My doctor calls me back. He said, oh, Mom's on the phone with Mount Union. I said, well, cops are on the way. She went, there's been a break-in. And she just started going off.
When Mr. Powell told her that the police were on their way, she immediately said there was an intruder. She started screaming. But up until that point, there was no other 911 call from that address. So that was a huge piece of information that kind of directed us a little bit about what might have happened. The focus became Sydney. Why didn't she reach out for help? Examining the scene itself, with the broken glass, there was blood inside, outside. It's kind of odd to have blood on both sides of the window. It was the opinion of all of us that the intruder scenario was highly unlikely.
As the interview progresses, Victim assistance workers come to offer Steve their support just before detectives receive word from the hospital.
Well, that's really bad news. Your wife passed away. What happened? We're not sure. It looks like, I don't think someone broke into the house. I don't know if your wife and daughter got into an argument, got physical. I mean, the window was broken, but there's no forced entry into the house. The window's broken, but nobody actually came through that window. And the sliding door was unlocked. So, did your wife and daughter ever have like really heated arguments? No.
I'm just trying to figure out in my head, what actually could have happened, because nothing was adding up to me. I had nothing to go on. I'm sure at that point I ended up going into shock of some sort, because I don't remember talking to them after that. I had to inform my son of what had happened, and after that it's pretty much a blur.
While Steve copes with the heartbreaking news, investigators must reassess the situation. The lack of forced entry into the home, combined with signs of an altercation, suggest a painful possibility.
I think he had some kind of idea that Sydney was responsible for this. I don't think he thought that there was an intruder, even though he might not wanted to believe it. At that point, we know we were dealing with a homicide investigation. It was just very unusual that we're trying to piece together, okay, was there an intruder or did Sydney do this?
Despite her claims of a break-in, Sydney Powell has become an unexpected person of interest in her mother's murder. Since Brenda was on the phone with university administrators when she was attacked, detectives review her cell phone records for more information.
What we know from looking at the cell phone records is there was about 3 minutes and 30 seconds between that first call and the second call. And what we know is all of the injuries to Brenda happened within that 3 minutes and 30 seconds.
Investigators speak with the Deans to corroborate.
They were in the middle of a conversation with Brenda Powell, but then they heard thumping and screaming, and then the phone went dead. They were very emotional about it, and they just didn't know what to make of it.
The Deans say after the line went dead, they immediately tried to call back. And after a few attempts, someone answered.
And what they described as a calm voice, "This is Brenda." And Dean Gaffney and Dean Frazier, having known Sydney as a student, they knew right away that that was Sydney. They asked her, "Sydney, is that you?" And then the phone went dead again.
Sydney's behavior on the phone, where she says, "This is Brenda," where she's pretending to be her, saying everything's fine, it's a falsehood.
She never said anything about an intruder. So we began more and more as we looked into this that was unlikely and that Sydney was actually responsible for this.
Forensic analysis seems to support police suspicions.
When the crime scene unit came, we started taking our time looking at the scene. It appeared with the knife and the skillet that those most likely came from inside of the house.
The most damning evidence is a set of bloody footprints in the house.
We were able to eliminate any foreign shoe being involved. It was Sydney's. We knew that the main incident happened in the bedroom, and by observing all that blood all over the place in different locations throughout, it was clear to us that, Sydney had been moving throughout the house. at different times, before and after the police arrived.
Although Sydney appeared traumatized at the time, the evidence indicates she attempted to cover up what she'd done.
The window's broken, Dad!
Where?
The back window's broken in!
The broken window was at the very rear of the house. We didn't see any rock or any object that would have done it, so we think that she most likely did it with her own hands, because she did have blood on her hands. After she knew the police were coming, she most likely broke out the windows to portray an intruder instead of what really happened. We're 4 or 5 hours into the investigation. We got authorization to sign charges on her for murder, for murdering her mother. We took her into custody. She didn't make any further statements.
It's no longer a whodunit. We know who did it. But anytime you handle a homicide that involves family members, why is always going to be the first question.
When I first heard Sydney was arrested, I had the same response everybody heard. There was no way that anybody that knew Sydney and Brenda would have guessed that this would have been the scenario that played out.
I've never seen anything this brutal before. Brenda had severe head trauma, and she had multiple stab wounds right below the base of her neck, between her shoulders. It's going through our minds that, what could happen to cause that much rage.
Following Sydney's arrest, detectives visit her university to better understand her psychological state.
After talking with the officials at Mount Union, we learned quite a bit about the situation that was going on with Sydney.
Sydney starts Mount Union fall of 2018. She goes there with one of her best friends. She joins a sorority, and by all appearances starts to just live a normal college life. She completes her first year, and everything seems to be going fine. But it's fall 2019 when we notice that her grades start slipping.
Sydney went from a 3.8 grade point average down to academic probation within 2 semesters. So something was clearly wrong with Sydney.
There's conversations with deans, and eventually she winds up being disenrolled as a student in that spring 2020 semester.
Sydney went home for Christmas break, and she just couldn't tell her parents that she had been expelled or suspended from school.
Sydney's college friends tell investigators she came back from the break acting like nothing was wrong.
She even went back for the spring semester in January of 2020 and continued to even try to convince her friends and her roommates that she was still a student when in fact she wasn't.
She was still going to classes, even though she wasn't in them. She was trying to figure out ways of getting in the dorm building.
We talked to Sydney's roommate and best friend. She would see her leave with a book bag. They went to social events together like there were everybody else in Sydney's life. She had no idea that Sydney was no longer a student. Did you notice any, change in her mood? Was she talking about anything? Or?
When we were just talking or with our friends, she always seemed happy. I couldn't tell until the end where she was kind of just like struggling and she kind of was sad. I could tell she was getting more upset and more sad. And I told her, if you need anything, I'm here. But she never really opened up.
Sydney was really trying to keep up this facade that everything in her world was okay when it was all completely crumbling.
Mount Union's a small campus. The deans are obviously aware of what's going on with Sydney and find out she's still trying to stay on campus and pretend to be a student. And they pretty much make it clear to her she can't keep doing that.
Sydney's friends say she moved out of her dorm a week before the murder.
Through examination of her phone, computer, we knew that she was doing Google searches from various hotels and that she had not been home.
The school has made it pretty clear she's not allowed to stay on campus anymore. But she also knows she can't go home without letting her parents know what's been going on. So she doesn't want to choose that either. She's running out of money. She's running out of options.
Coming up, was this a crime of passion or a mental health crisis?
There was no leading indicators that it would be that type of diagnoses.
And a divisive trial ensues.
I did not meet a family member that wanted a murder conviction, that wanted a life sentence for Sydney, not one.
Sidney Powell's murder trial is set to begin in February 2022. 2 years after the brutal attack on her mother, Brenda Powell. Just before the court date arrives, prosecutors discover how she intends to plead.
Our defense was she was insane at the time, and that prevented her from knowing the wrongfulness of her conduct. One of the different things about not guilty by reason of insanity is that the defense has the burden to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that the person is suffering from a severe mental disease or defect. She was being held involuntarily at the psychiatric unit. During that stay, they finally diagnosed her with schizophrenia. This is the age when these serious mental diseases start to manifest. Late teens, early 20s for females.
It was very surprising to hear that that is what the diagnosis was, because there was no leading indicators that would be that type of diagnosis.
The doctors started treating her immediately with antipsychotropic drugs, and she stabilized to the point where she could be released from a psychiatric hospital.
Sydney is released on bond to her family while she awaits trial.
My job was now to make sure she is now going to be taken care of. I took her down to Brenda's mom's. They have a farm down in eastern Ohio. She would always be really good with the horses and the dogs out there. You know, outwardly she was, getting better.
Sydney's lawyers had 3 doctors evaluate her, and they all had the same conclusion.
What all 3 of these doctors said is she was experiencing long periods of lucid thoughts, but they were interrupted by serious and significant psychotic episodes. That first serious psychotic break occurred with her and Brenda, unfortunately, the day that Brenda was killed. I mean, it just doesn't make sense that the reason she killed her mom was because she got kicked out of school. Killing Brenda doesn't solve that problem. That kind of attack, that kind of brutality is completely out of character for Sydney, and it screams insanity. When we watch Sydney on the body cam, when police first arrive, she's completely disassociated.
Where's your mom at?
No, there's so much blood. No, please!
She had no recollection of any violence with her and her mother, but she's coming to and she's seeing this horrific crime scene, and she's trying to make sense of what's going on. Each and every doctor that saw that video, saw that footage, said that's a catatonic state.
Sydney! What's going on?
Brenda's family tells prosecutors they also don't think Sydney should be held responsible for her actions, and they ask that she be declared unfit for trial.
I'm very supportive. Her grandparents are very supportive. Her brother's supportive. The goal for the whole family and for Sydney is just to get her better, and we want her back.
Nobody close to Brenda or Steve or Sydney was wishing to pursue this criminally.
We weren't asking them to let her go scot-free or without any of the analysis by the doctors. We wanted them to look at seriously and consider those 3 separate medical opinions showing that she was not guilty by reason of insanity. That's all we wanted.
The state ultimately decides to continue in pursuit of a trial.
The standard in Ohio is that not only does a person have some kind of mental disease going on at the time, but it's because of that mental disease that they couldn't appreciate the wrongfulness of their actions. While she may have had some mental health issues at the time, her actions around the crime are clearly consistent with someone who knew exactly what they were doing and then tried to cover it up. Sydney never stops the cover-up. You know, even in the seconds afterwards when the dean calls back and she's able to talk to him, she is still saying, no, I'm Brenda. She pretends to be her mom.
So I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't have a medical degree. I can only look at the evidence that we have. When she called her dad, she had just brutally killed her mother, but she was still, to me, thinking, okay, I need to do something to make the police think that I didn't do this, to make them think that there's an intruder.
In preparation for the trial, prosecutors hire their own expert to evaluate Sydney.
Dr. Obradovich takes a look at the case file, interviews the defendant, gets her hands on as much information as possible, and ultimately comes to the conclusion that Sydney is competent to stand trial and that she was sane at the time of the crime.
The psychologist interprets Sydney's behavior not as evidence of insanity, but as a trauma response caused by witnessing her own brutal actions.
Sydney was also diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of what she had done to her mom and all the after effects.
Prosecutors seek a trial date, but it's delayed by the COVID pandemic.
Sydney was out on bond for about 3.5 years before the case went to trial.
She actually thrived while out on bond. She helped out with the horses on the farm, and it was helpful to her. Pursuant to the doctors, she improved.
I understood what they were charging her with. I understood what happened. I understood everything, but still, in my heart of hearts, I'm still thinking this is not happening. This is not what nobody wanted it.
There were multiple attempts to come to a resolution to the trial prior to, so the family wouldn't have to go back through this. I was disappointed that this didn't happen in this case. It seemed to me prosecutors were interested in one thing and one thing only, which was a guilty verdict.
After multiple postponements, Sydney Powell's murder trial begins on September 7th, 2023, nearly 4 years after the death of her mother.
Our heart goes out to the family in this case. I know that they had different wishes, and I do respect that. But ultimately, we have to do our job and prosecute a crime.
What the whole trial centered upon was, did she know what she was doing, or was it under the influence of some type of mental disability?
What you have is a battle of the experts.
It was really all or nothing. And what I mean by that is it was either guilty of murder or not guilty by reason of insanity.
The trial is broadcast on television and streamed online.
Watching the trial was hard. I think myself, along with everyone else who tuned in, just wanted to know why. Why did she do the gruesome things that she did to her mom? Who was her best friend, confidant, or someone that, really loved and supported her?
You just look into her eyes like that's not her. She's not there. Seeing the body cam footage was, I think, harder than I thought it was going to be. Hearing her yell.
Is she gonna be okay?
The Sydney Powell I knew wouldn't ever do something like that.
Sydney!
We think the evidence showed clearly and conclusively that
What's going on?
Sydney was in the midst of a horrific, psychotic, violent break and did not know the wrongfulness of her conduct.
After 2 weeks of hearing the evidence, the case rests in the hands of the jury.
Unfortunately, they came back and said murder.
They do not buy that she was insane at the time.
In the state of Ohio, there's only one sentence for murder, and that is life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. So the judge imposed that sentence. Although we were prepared for, as best you can, a guilty verdict, it was still soul-crushing.
We understand that this was not Sydney. This was a very small little snippet in time that something went horribly wrong.
To the investigators and the prosecutors, it wasn't from mental illness, it was just from a problem that had built up and finally came to a head when the truth came out.
It's in that moment when she makes that decision that she's going to stop her mom from having a conversation from the dean. In that split second when she realized that her lie was going to be uncovered, she snapped.
Within that state that she was in, she had more power than she realized. Deep down, I feel like she wasn't intentionally trying to kill her mom.
Even after her conviction, Sydney's loved ones are pursuing an appeal.
I think she knows, and if she doesn't, we tell her that, we still love her. Brenda would want us to continue to fight. I have that sense of feeling that she is right there with us, leading this charge to help Sydney. A lot of people told me how much Brenda touched, maybe not even their lives, but their cousin or anybody. She just could do that.
I've spent a lot of time with Sydney, and Sydney, more than anyone on the planet, is trying to search for some answer. And, she is also incredibly remorseful and grieving the loss of her mom, the loss of her best friend.
I really feel for the Powell family. It's tragic. I feel for Steve having to lose his wife in this manner and then essentially lose his daughter. I can't imagine what they're going through. It's just tragic.
After Brenda's passing, we tried to figure out a way to keep her memory alive. And they actually came up with a Brenda K. Powell scholarship that's at Akron Children's Hospital that gives financial reward for kids that have gone through cancer and are going on to higher education. Brenda, loved working with the kids at the hospital. That's just the way Brenda was. She was like the mother to them all. She was just a sweet soul.
The file was never meant to be opened again. It sat in silence for nearly half a century, sealed inside a gray archive box stamped with a date most people had long forgotten. London, December 1975. A winter that pressed down hard on the city, where fog rolled through the streets like something alive, swallowing sound, distorting shapes, turning every passing shadow into something uncertain. It was the kind of night where people walked faster, kept their heads down, avoided eye contact. The kind of night where something could happen and no one would be sure they saw it clearly. At 11:17 p.m., she passed under the same flickering street lamp she crossed every night. Her routine never changed. Same path, same pace, same quiet presence moving through a city that barely noticed her. 23 years old.
No enemies.
No history of risk. The kind of life that doesn't suddenly vanish without reason. But at 11:42 p.m., the routine broke. The light inside her flat turned off. And after that, nothing.
No scream. No crash.
No call for help. Just silence. By morning, the city had already moved on. Commuters filled buses, newspapers screamed about politics and unrest, and somewhere in a narrow residential block, a door remained slightly ajar. It wasn't enough to alarm anyone at first. Just a detail, easily ignored. But inside, something was wrong. The air felt disturbed, out of place. A cup of tea sat on the table, cold and untouched, the surface of it still, as if time itself had stopped mid-motion. Her coat hung neatly where she had left it. Everything was in order. Everything except one thing. A single shoe lay on the floor near the doorway. Just one. Not tossed. Not kicked off casually. It sat at an angle that made no sense, as if it had been removed halfway through a step or pulled away by someone else. That was the moment the scene shifted. From ordinary to something else. Something controlled. Something deliberate. Police arrived within the hour. At first, it followed the familiar rhythm of a missing person report. Questions. Notes. Assumptions. Maybe she left voluntarily. Maybe she stepped out. But the longer they stood inside that flat, the less that theory held together. There were no signs of packing. No missing belongings. No reason to leave without a coat on a freezing December night. And then there were the marks. Subtle. Almost invisible. A faint scuff along the wall near the entrance. A slight disturbance in the dust near the floor. Not enough to scream violence, but enough to suggest movement. A struggle, perhaps, but a quiet one. Controlled. Efficient. The kind that doesn't leave chaos behind. The kind that ends quickly. Neighbors were questioned. Doors knocked. Lights switched on. Faces appeared, confused, half asleep, trying to remember anything unusual. But memory in a city like London fades quickly, especially when nothing seemed wrong at the time. No one heard a scream. No one saw a break-in. No one noticed anything worth reporting. And that was the most unsettling part. Because something had happened. And no one noticed. The first lead came days later. A man, hesitant, unsure of himself, walked into a station and said he might have seen something that night. Not the act. Not the victim. Just a figure. Standing across the street from the building. Still. Watching. He couldn't explain why it bothered him. Only that it did. Because people don't stand that still in the cold without a reason. Detectives pressed him for details. Height. Build. Clothing. But the answers shifted with every retelling. Tall became average. Dark coat became maybe gray. The longer he spoke, the less certain he sounded. Fear does that. It reshapes memory, fills in gaps with imagination, blurs what was real with what might have been. In the end, his statement was filed but marked unreliable.
Still, it planted something.
The idea that someone had been there before it happened. Watching. Waiting. The investigation widened. Friends. Co-workers.
Family.
No one had noticed anything unusual. No sudden changes.
No threats. No arguments.
Her life had been quiet. Predictable. Safe. And that made the disappearance feel even more violent. Because it wasn't just an interruption. It was an erasure. Weeks passed. The story briefly touched the newspapers. Young woman missing. Mysterious disappearance. Words that carried weight for a day, maybe two, before being replaced by louder headlines. London had other concerns.
Strikes. Crime.
Politics. The city moved forward. It always does. But inside the investigation room, something refused to settle. Then came another report. Another woman. Same district. Similar age. She claimed she had been followed late at night. Not approached. Not attacked. Just followed. At a distance. Always far enough to avoid confrontation but close enough to feel intentional. She turned corners, changed pace, even stopped once. The figure behind her stopped too. Mirroring. Observing. She reported it. Nothing came of it. No crime.
No suspect.
No name.
Just a feeling.
Detectives connected the two cases cautiously. It wasn't enough to confirm anything, but it suggested a pattern. Someone who studied. Someone who chose carefully. Someone who didn't act on impulse, but on preparation. That changed the direction of the investigation. They returned to the streets. This time, they didn't ask what people saw. They asked what people felt. And slowly, fragments surfaced. A man seen twice near the same bus stop. A shadow lingering too long outside a building. Footsteps that seemed to follow, but never catch up. None of it solid. None of it provable. But all of it consistent. Still, there was no face. No identity. No way forward. Months turned into a year. Leads collapsed under scrutiny. Witnesses contradicted themselves. Evidence remained too thin to build a case. And eventually the label was applied. Cold case. Two words that don't just describe an investigation, they bury it. The file was archived. Shelved. Forgotten by most. But not by everyone. Some detectives carried it with them. Not physically, but mentally. Because certain cases don't close. They linger. They return in quiet moments, in late nights, in the silence between other cases. The image of that flat, the untouched tea, the single shoe, it stayed. Years passed. Then decades. London changed. Streets rebuilt. Buildings replaced. People moved on. Witnesses aged. Memories faded. Some died. The city erased the surface of what had happened, but underneath the file remained. Waiting. And then, nearly 50 years later, it was opened again. Not by a detective chasing justice. Not by a witness seeking closure. But by accident. A young records clerk, assigned to digitize old files, pulled the box from storage. Routine. Mechanical. Just another name. Just another case. Until she saw the photograph. The room. The stillness. The shoe. Something about it felt unfinished. Incomplete. She flagged it. At first, it was ignored. Most old cases are. But persistence has a way of breaking through. Eventually, it reached a review team. Small. Specialized. Equipped with modern tools that didn't exist in 1975. Technology that could extract meaning from what once looked like nothing. They reopened the file.
Carefully.
Methodically. Every note reread. Every image re-examined. Every assumption questioned. And that's when they found it. A detail buried in evidence logs. Collected but never truly understood. Something that had been there from the beginning. Something everyone had seen. But no one had recognized. And now, decades later, it was about to change everything. The evidence had been sitting in storage for 48 years, sealed in a brittle paper envelope marked with a handwritten label that had begun to fade into near illegibility. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't overlooked in the sense of being lost. It had simply never mattered, at least not in 1975. Back then, it was just another item logged at the scene, bagged and cataloged by officers who were trained to collect everything, even the things they didn't understand. A fragment. A trace. Something too small to raise suspicion, too insignificant to pursue. But time changes the value of things. Inside the envelope was a fiber, barely visible to the naked eye. A dull, synthetic strand, clinging to the inner lining of the victim's coat. It had been noted in the original report, foreign fiber, origin unknown, then dismissed. In 1975, it was meaningless. There were no databases to compare it against, no way to trace it back to a manufacturer, no system to connect it to a person. It was evidence without context. Now, it was different. The review team worked in silence as the envelope was reopened. Gloves on, lights adjusted, every movement controlled. The fiber was extracted carefully, placed under magnification.
It looked ordinary.
Unremarkable. But the moment it entered the system, everything began to shift. Modern forensic analysis didn't just identify materials, it mapped them,
broke them down,
linked them to sources that hadn't existed decades ago. The first result came back within hours. Synthetic nylon blend. Industrial grade. Not clothing. Not upholstery. Something else. The room grew quieter. They ran it again. Confirmed the composition, then expanded the search, cross-referenced manufacturing records, production timelines, distribution chains. It took days, then weeks. But slowly, the fiber began to point somewhere. Not a person, not yet, but a category, a function. Restraint material. Used in specific industrial packaging. And in something else. Something darker. The connection wasn't immediate. It came in fragments, pieced together by analysts who had seen patterns like this before. The fiber matched material used in specialized cord bindings, thin, durable, rarely sold to the general public in the 1970s. It wasn't common. It wasn't something someone would casually have in their home. Which meant one thing. Whoever had been in that flat that night had brought it with them. The investigation shifted instantly. This was no longer a disappearance. It hadn't been random. It hadn't been impulsive. It had been planned, prepared, executed with precision. They went back to the original reports, reread every line, every assumption, and slowly, the past began to unravel. That single shoe on the floor, it wasn't just an odd detail anymore. It was evidence of interruption, a moment where movement had been stopped, where control had been established. The lack of struggle made sense now. The absence of noise, the stillness of the scene. She hadn't had time to react. The team expanded their search again, this time looking for other cases, other disappearances, other reports that had never been connected. London in the 1970s was filled with noise, crime, chaos, overlapping investigations that often never crossed paths. But patterns don't disappear. They hide. And then they found it. A second case. Same year. Same district. A woman reported missing. Different circumstances, but similar details. Last seen late at night. No signs of forced entry.
No witnesses.
No resolution. The file had been closed even faster than the first. They pulled it. Compared the evidence. And there it was. Another fiber. Same composition. Same origin. The room shifted again. This wasn't a single incident. It was something repeated. Something practiced. They dug deeper. Third case. This time, not a disappearance, but an attempted abduction. The victim survived.
Barely.
Her statement had been inconsistent, fragmented by trauma, dismissed at the time as unreliable. But now, with fresh eyes, it read differently. She described a man who moved quickly, silently,
who didn't speak,
who used something thin, something tight to restrain her wrists. She couldn't describe it clearly, just that it cut into the skin and felt like wire, but softer. At the time, it meant nothing. Now, it meant everything. The cases aligned. Not perfectly, but enough. The same method, the same timing, the same absence of noise, the same lack of witnesses. A figure moving through the city unnoticed, choosing carefully, acting precisely, leaving almost nothing behind. Almost. Because that fiber had been left behind. And now it had a voice. The investigation moved into a new phase. This was no longer about what happened. It was about who had access to that material, who could have obtained it, who worked with it, who understood it. They traced the manufacturing origins, limited suppliers, specific industries, warehousing, shipping, industrial packaging companies operating in London during the mid-1970s. The list wasn't long, but it wasn't small either. Dozens of names, hundreds of employees. Too many. But patterns narrow over time. They cross-referenced employment records, focused on men working night shifts, men with access to transport, men who lived within proximity of the victims' locations. The list shrank, slowly, methodically, each filter removing another layer of anonymity. Then came the first name. It didn't stand out at first. Just another employee, warehouse operator. No criminal record, no history of violence. Stable employment, quiet life. The kind of person who blends in, the kind of person no one remembers noticing. But when they looked closer, small things began to surface. He had worked night shifts during the exact period of the disappearances. He had access to the specific material identified in the fiber analysis. He lived within walking distance of both locations. And there was something else. A report. Filed in 1976. Minor incident. A woman claimed a man had followed her late at night. She couldn't identify him clearly, but she described his posture. The way he stood.
Still.
Watching. Waiting. The report had been dismissed. But the description it echoed. The team dug deeper into his history. Employment records. Address changes. Known associates. Nothing overt, nothing that screamed guilt. But absence can be as telling as presence. No long-term relationships. No close connections. A life lived on the edges of visibility. Invisible.
Until now.
They requested a warrant. Carefully built. Based on circumstantial evidence. Patterns. Forensic links. It wasn't enough for an arrest. Not yet. But it was enough to look closer. To step into a life that had remained untouched for decades. When they found him, he was older. Of course he was. Time had done its work. Hair gone gray. Movements slower. But the stillness remained. The same stillness described in reports nearly 50 years earlier. The same quiet presence that had once stood across a street, watching a building, waiting for the right moment. He didn't run. Didn't resist. Just watched them the way he had watched everything else. Silently. And in that silence something shifted. Because for the first time since 1975, the case wasn't just a file anymore. It had a face.
He had a face now. A name.
A life that could be mapped, measured, dissected. But what he didn't have, what he had never given anyone, was an answer. The interview room was smaller than expected. Neutral walls. A table that had seen too many stories collapse under pressure. A camera fixed in the corner. Red light blinking softly, recording every breath, every pause. He sat still, hands folded, eyes forward.
No tremor.
No visible fear. Just that same quiet presence described in reports from nearly 50 years earlier. Detectives entered without ceremony. No raised voices.
No immediate accusations.
Just observation. Because sometimes the first reaction tells more than any confession ever could. He looked up once. Briefly. Not startled. Not confused. Just aware. They began with the present.
Name. Address.
Employment history. Simple questions. Anchors. Establishing rhythm. He answered calmly. Precisely.
No hesitation.
The kind of control that doesn't come from innocence, but from practice. Then they shifted. London, 1975.
The air in the room changed.
He didn't move. Didn't blink. Just listened. They laid out the timeline slowly. The victim, the disappearance, the scene, the single shoe, the untouched tea. Every detail spoken out loud. Not for him, but for the silence. Because silence reacts. It tightens. It fractures.
But not this time.
He remained still. So they pushed further. The fiber. That got a reaction. Not visible at first. Not something anyone would notice without watching closely. But it was there. A pause half a second too long. A shift in his gaze. The smallest fracture in control. Because evidence doesn't accuse, it reveals. And for the first time, something had reached him. They explained it carefully. Modern analysis. Industrial nylon. Limited distribution. Tied to his workplace. To his access. To his movement through the city during the exact nights the disappearances occurred. Still no response. Just that silence. But silence isn't emptiness. It's resistance. They changed approach. Not accusations. Stories. They spoke about the second case. Another woman. Same year. Same district. Another disappearance buried under time. They described the similarities. The patterns. The way both cases had been dismissed, overlooked, allowed to fade. Then the third. The survivor. That's when his posture shifted.
Barely.
But enough. Because survivors carry something different. Something unpredictable. They don't just describe events, they disrupt narratives. And his narrative, whatever it was, had remained untouched for decades.
Until now.
They read her statement aloud. The fragments. The fear. The description of restraint.
Thin. Tight.
Cutting into skin. Not wire something softer. Something controlled. His fingers tightened. Just slightly. But it was there. The room felt smaller. The detectives didn't stop. They layered it. Evidence over evidence. Pattern over pattern. Not forcing a confession, but building a reality he couldn't ignore. Because denial requires distance. And they were closing that distance piece by piece. Finally, they asked the question. Simple.
Direct.
Where were you that night? It hung in the air. Heavy. Unavoidable. He didn't answer immediately. For the first time, there was hesitation. Real hesitation. Not calculated. Not controlled. Something else. Something older. Buried. Then he spoke. I don't remember. It was expected. Predictable. But it wasn't enough. Because memory fades, but patterns don't. They shifted again. Brought out photographs. The flat. The doorway.
The shoe.
He looked at them. Longer than necessary. And in that moment, something surfaced. Not guilt. Not fear recognition. The kind that doesn't belong to coincidence. Detectives saw it. Felt it. But still, no admission. So they changed the angle. Not the crime.
The time.
They talked about London in 1975. The streets.
The fog.
The way the city moved at night. They described the silence. The isolation. The way someone could watch without being seen. Follow without being noticed. Wait without being questioned. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he leaned forward. Not much. Just enough. Because they weren't talking about a crime anymore. They were talking about him. They mentioned the reports, the sightings, the man who stood still across the street, the figure who followed at a distance, the presence people felt but couldn't explain. And for the first time, he spoke without being asked. People imagine things, he said.
His voice was steady.
But it carried something new. A crack. Detectives didn't interrupt. Didn't challenge. They let it sit. Because once someone begins to explain, they reveal more than they intend. He continued. They see shadows. They think it's someone watching them, but it's just the way light moves, the way streets look at night. It sounded rehearsed. Practiced. Like something he had told himself many times. But underneath it there was something else. Familiarity. Too much familiarity. They leaned into it. Were you there? Another pause. Longer this time. Then. I worked nights. Not a denial. Not an answer. Just a fact. But facts in the right context become admissions. They pressed. Near that street? Silence. Then. Sometimes. The room tightened. Every word now carried weight. Every pause mattered. Because control was slipping. Slowly. Quietly. But undeniably. They brought the fiber back. Explained how it matched material from his workplace. How it had been found on the victim. How it connected him, not directly, not conclusively, but enough to place him inside a space he had never admitted entering. He looked down. For the first time. Just briefly. But it was enough. Because people don't look away from lies. They look away from truth. The detective leaned forward. Voice lower now. Not aggressive. Not forceful. Just precise. You were there. Silence. You watched her. No response. You followed her.
A breath. Subtle.
But real. And you went inside. That's when it broke. Not completely. Not a confession. But something shifted behind his eyes. A memory, maybe. Or the weight of one. He exhaled slowly. And for a moment the room felt like it had slipped back in time. London. Fog pressing against windows. Streetlights flickering. A figure standing still across the road. Watching. Waiting.
He spoke again.
Quieter this time. I didn't mean for it to happen like that. The words landed hard. Because they weren't denial. They weren't confusion. They were distance. Distance from responsibility. From intent. But not from the act itself. Detectives didn't move. Didn't interrupt. Because this was the moment. The thin edge between silence and truth. He continued. It wasn't supposed to escalate. The word hung in the air.
Cold.
Calculated. Escalate. Not panic. Not accident. Escalate. Which meant there had been a plan. A progression.
Steps.
And something had gone beyond them. The detective spoke carefully. What happened inside the flat? No answer. Just breathing now.
Slower. Heavier.
Because memory, once opened, doesn't close easily. It spills. Fragments at first. Then pieces. Then something closer to the whole. But never clean. Never complete. He looked at the photograph again.
The shoe.
And for a second, just a second, his expression changed. Not remorse. Not fully. But something close. Something human. Buried under decades of silence. I told her to stay quiet, he said.
Soft.
Controlled. I didn't want to hurt her. The room went still. Because intention doesn't erase outcome. It reveals it. And now, after nearly 50 years, the silence was breaking. But not fast enough. Not clean enough. Because even now he was holding something back. Something deeper. Something that hadn't surfaced yet. And the detectives knew it. Because cases like this don't end with one answer. They unravel. Slowly.
Piece by piece.
And what comes next is never what anyone expects. He stopped there, as if the words themselves had reached a boundary he refused to cross. The room held its breath. The hum of the recorder filled the silence, steady, indifferent, capturing every second that stretched longer than it should. Detectives didn't rush him. They knew better. Moments like this don't respond to pressure. They fracture under it. And whatever was beginning to surface inside him, it needed space to come out. He stared at the photograph again.
The shoe.
That single detail that had haunted an investigation for decades. His eyes didn't move. Fixed. Locked onto it as if it were the only thing in the room that mattered. She moved, he said finally. The words were quiet, controlled, but they carried weight. Detectives leaned in slightly. Not enough to interrupt, just enough to stay inside the moment. She wasn't supposed to move. There it was again. That language. Not fear. Not panic. Expectation. A script that had been written in his mind long before that night. Something planned. Something rehearsed. What do you mean? The detective asked, voice low, steady. He exhaled slowly. I told her what to do. I told her to stay still. To be quiet. That's all she had to do. The calmness in his tone didn't match the words. It never does. Because people who plan control don't see it as violence. They see it as order. As something that should work if everyone plays their part. But she didn't, he continued. And just like that, the narrative shifted. Not his actions. Hers. Because that's how it lives in his memory. Not as something he did, but something that went wrong. She turned, he said, almost to himself. She looked at me. A pause.
Long.
Heavy. As if she knew. The detective didn't speak. Didn't need to. Because now the room was no longer about questions. It was about unraveling something that had been locked away for nearly 50 years. What happened next? Another voice asked, softer this time. He swallowed.
Subtle.
But visible. I had to stop her. The words landed cold. Not frantic. Not emotional. Just inevitable. How? The detective asked. Silence. Then, the cord. There it was. Not a guess anymore. Not a theory. A detail.
Real.
Present. And suddenly, everything aligned. The fiber, the marks, the stillness of the scene. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't struggle in the way people imagine it. It was controlled, measured. A moment that moved too fast to leave noise behind, but not fast enough to leave no trace. She fought, he added. First time, he acknowledged resistance. First time he stepped outside his version of control. But not for long. The room felt smaller now, air heavier, because every word was pulling the past closer, making it real again, stripping away decades of distance. What did you do after? The detective asked. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted away from the photograph for the first time, landing somewhere undefined. Somewhere internal. Searching. I stayed, he said. That wasn't expected. Detectives exchanged a glance. For how long? I don't know. That was the first honest uncertainty. Because time in moments like that doesn't behave normally. It stretches, warps, breaks into fragments that don't align when remembered later. I just stayed. Doing what? Watching? Thinking?
Waiting?
He didn't say. What did you do with her? The question came, sharper now. More direct. His jaw tightened. A boundary again. But thinner this time. I couldn't leave her there. Another shift. Responsibility, but distorted. Why not? They would find her. Of course they would. That's what happens. But in his mind, discovery wasn't justice. It was exposure. And you didn't want that? The detective asked. No answer. Just silence. But silence now wasn't protection. It was confirmation. They pressed again. What did you do? He closed his eyes briefly.
First time.
As if replaying something he hadn't allowed himself to see in years. Then, I moved her. The words dropped slowly.
Carefully.
As if saying them out loud made them more real than they had been in his memory. Where? No response. The room tightened again. Where did you take her? His breathing changed. Slightly faster. Not panic. But pressure. Because this was different. This wasn't about what happened in the flat. This was about what came after. And that had stayed hidden for nearly half a century. We can find it, the detective said quietly. Not a threat. Not a bluff. Just truth. Technology has changed. He didn't look convinced. People like him don't trust change. They trust what they've already gotten away with. You left traces, the detective continued. You didn't know it then, but you did. A pause. Then, We already found one. The fiber. A reminder. A crack in the illusion of control. His fingers shifted on the table. Small movement. But enough. Because now, for the first time, he wasn't entirely certain. Not about what they knew. Not about what they could find. And uncertainty is where control begins to collapse. Where did you take her? The question came again.
Softer.
Closer. He exhaled.
Long. Slow.
And when he spoke this time, the words were different. Not controlled. Not rehearsed. Just heavy. Outside the city. The detectives didn't react outwardly. But inside, everything sharpened. Where? I don't remember exactly. Not good enough. Not anymore. You do, the detective said. Firm now.
Certain.
You remember. Another pause. Longer.
Deeper.
Because memory doesn't disappear. It hides. And right now it was being pulled back into the light. There was water, he said finally. A fragment. But a critical one. Water? The detective repeated. He nodded slightly. Near a road.
Not busy.
Quiet. Every detail mattered now. Every word narrowed the search. A river? A canal? The detective asked. He hesitated. Maybe. Not precise. But real. Did you bury her? Silence. Then. Yes. The room froze. Because that was it. The moment the case changed completely. From disappearance to murder. Officially. Finally. After 48 years. But even now, it wasn't over. Because location matters. Closure depends on it. And he still hadn't given enough. Where? The question came again. This time, there was no softness left. No room for distance. Where did you bury her? He looked up. Straight at them. And for the first time, there was something in his eyes. Not fear. Not exactly. But awareness. That the past had caught up. That the silence he had lived inside for decades
was gone.
I can show you, he said. The words were quiet. But they changed everything. Because now, the investigation wasn't about theory. Or reconstruction. Or fragments. It was about truth. Buried. Waiting. And finally, within reach. They moved before the moment could cool.
No delay.
No space for him to reconsider, to retreat back into silence. Paperwork accelerated, signatures pulled, a transport team assembled in a rhythm that felt rehearsed, inevitable. Outside, London carried on with its morning pulse. Traffic building, pedestrians threading through crosswalks, headlines shifting on digital screens, unaware that beneath the surface, something buried for nearly half a century had begun to rise. He sat in the back of the vehicle, wrists secured, posture unchanged. Still.
Composed.
Watching through the window as the city passed by in fragments of glass and motion. Streets he once walked without being noticed. Corners he had memorized in another life. Nothing in his expression suggested recognition, but memory doesn't always show itself on the face. Sometimes it sits deeper, waiting for the right angle, the right turn, the right smell of damp air to unlock it. Detective sat across from him, silent, studying, not pushing,
not asking.
Because now the weight had shifted. He had offered something. A location, or at least the promise of one. And promises like that don't come easily after decades of silence. They knew better than to rush it. The city thinned as they drove. Buildings gave way to longer stretches of road, fewer lights, wider spaces between structures. The noise softened. London receded behind them, replaced by something quieter, older. The kind of place where time moves differently, where the past doesn't disappear, it settles. He leaned forward slightly. "Slow down," he said. The driver didn't respond immediately. Just a glance in the mirror. A signal passed without words. The vehicle eased off speed. "Here?" the detective asked. He didn't answer right away. His eyes moved, scanning, measuring. Not searching randomly, recognizing. That was the difference. This wasn't guesswork. This was memory resurfacing, aligning with the present. "Not yet," he said. They continued. The road narrowed. Trees thickened along the sides, branches leaning inward, cutting off the sky in uneven patterns of shadow and light. A river appeared briefly through the gaps, dark, slow-moving, almost silent. It slipped in and out of view as they drove, never fully revealing itself. He watched it. And something in his expression shifted. "Stop," he said. The word landed with certainty. The vehicle pulled over. Engines idled. Doors opened. The air outside was colder than expected, carrying the damp scent of soil and water. It clung to everything. Shoes pressed into gravel as they stepped out, the sound sharp in the quiet. He stood there for a moment, breathing it in. Not nostalgia. Recognition. "This way," he said. They moved off the road into the trees. The ground was uneven, layered with leaves and years of undisturbed growth. Every step carried weight, not just physical, but historical, because somewhere beneath this ground, something had been hidden. Something that had waded through seasons, through storms, through decades of silence. Detectives spread out slightly, maintaining distance but keeping him in view. No one spoke. No instructions needed. The gravity of the moment controlled everything. He walked slowly, deliberately. Not wandering. Following. Branches brushed against coats, the sound dry, brittle. The river grew louder as they moved closer, not in volume, but in presence. That low, constant movement that never stops, never forgets. He stopped. Looked around. Turned slightly. Then pointed. There. Just one word. But it landed heavier than anything said before. They marked the spot immediately. GPS logged. Photographs taken. Every angle recorded. Procedure. Precise. Controlled. Because once you disturb a site like this, you can't undo it. Every layer matters. Every inch tells a story. Forensic teams moved in quickly. Gloves. Tools. Flags placed in measured patterns. The ground was soft, but compacted in places, subtle differences only visible to trained eyes. That's where they began. Digging doesn't start fast. It starts careful. Layer by layer. Soil removed in thin sections, sifted, examined. Every fragment checked. Every change in texture noted. Because after 48 years, time reshapes everything. What was once obvious becomes hidden. What was once hidden sometimes survives. He stood at a distance, watching. Silent again. But not the same silence as before. This one carried weight. Minutes turned into hours. The first sign came quietly. A change in soil color. Darker. Disturbed. Older than the layers above it. They slowed even further. Tools switched. Smaller. Finer. Precision over speed. Then. Contact. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a sound. A shift in resistance beneath the tool. Everything stopped. The air tightened. The team leaned in, carefully clearing. And then it appeared. Bone. Weathered. partial, but unmistakable. No one spoke.
They didn't need to.
Because this was it. The moment the case stopped being a question
And became an answer.
they expanded the area slowly, revealing more. Fragments at first, then structure. The outline of something that had once been a person. A life reduced to form, but still present. Still there. Still waiting. The river moved behind them, unchanged, as if it had watched this moment for decades, holding its silence until now. Detectives stepped closer, not interfering, just observing. Because this was more than evidence. This was confirmation. Of everything. Of the timeline. Of the act. Of the truth that had been buried beneath layers of time and earth. He didn't look away. Didn't flinch. Just watched. As if seeing it again. Not as it was now, but as it had been then. You brought her here, one detective said quietly. Not a question. A statement. He nodded.
Slow.
Yes.
No hesitation.
No distance this time. Just acknowledgement. Why here? A pause. Then, it was quiet.
Of course it was.
That had always been the point. Isolation. Control.
No witnesses. No interruption.
Just space. To act.
To hide.
To leave. The team continued working, uncovering more of the site, documenting everything. Each fragment placed carefully into evidence containers. Each detail recorded. Because even now, after all this time, the truth needed to be preserved correctly. The sun shifted overhead, light breaking through the trees in narrow beams, illuminating the ground in pieces. It didn't feel like closure. Not yet. It felt like something else. Exposure. Because what had been hidden was now visible. What had been denied was now real. And what had been a cold case was no longer cold. But even as the remains were uncovered, even as the investigation moved forward with renewed force, something lingered. Because one question still remained. One that hadn't been answered. Not fully.
Not yet.
And as detectives stood there, watching the past come back to the surface, they realized this case was far from over. The ground didn't give up its secrets all at once. It never does. Every layer peeled back revealed something new, something older, quieter, more fragile than the last. The team worked with precision, careful not to rush, careful not to disturb what time had preserved in its own silent way. Because this wasn't just recovery. It was reconstruction. A story buried in soil, waiting to be read again. The remains were incomplete at first glance, but enough to confirm what everyone already knew. Human. Female. Consistent with the age profile from 1975. The positioning told its own version of the truth. Curled slightly, constrained. Not laid to rest but placed. There was no ceremony here. No care. Just efficiency. Just the act of making something disappear. Detectives stood back, watching, absorbing every detail. The air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of confirmation. For decades, the case had existed in uncertainty, suspended between possibility and absence. Now it had form,
shape,
finality. But with answers come new questions. They turned to him again. He hadn't moved much, still standing where they left him, eyes fixed on the excavation site, as if the past unfolding in front of him wasn't shocking, but familiar. Expected. You buried her here, one detective said. Not a question. Yes. The answer came without resistance. Alone. A pause. Longer this time. Then. Yes. But it didn't feel complete. Because nothing about this case had ever been simple, and the deeper they went, the more layers emerged. Not contradictions, just omissions. Spaces where something should have been said, but wasn't. They pressed again. How did you bring her here? He shifted slightly. Car. That changed things. Whose car? Another pause. Then,
Meaning?
the team exchanged a glance. Because that detail hadn't appeared anywhere in the original investigation. No vehicle reports. No witnesses mentioning a car. Which meant one thing. He had been careful. Very careful. What kind of car? The detective asked. He frowned slightly. Thinking.
Dark. Sedan.
Not precise. But enough to build from. Where did you park? He gestured vaguely toward the road. Up there. The detective nodded, noting the direction. Every detail now mattered. Not just for confirmation, but for reconstruction. Because understanding how it happened meant understanding how it could have gone unnoticed. You carried her? He hesitated. Then nodded. Yes. The word landed heavy. Because it filled in the gap between the flat and the grave. The part no one had seen. The part that had existed only in theory. How far? He looked toward the trees. Not far. But distance is relative. Especially when carrying weight. Especially when moving through darkness. Did anyone see you?
No.
Immediate.
Certain.
Too certain. The detective didn't challenge it.
Not yet.
Instead, they shifted again. Back to the flat. What happened after she stopped moving? His eyes flickered. Briefly. Then steadied. I waited. The same answer as before. But now it carried more weight. More context. Why? A pause. Then. I didn't know what to do. That was new. Uncertainty. Not control. For the first time, the narrative cracked in a different way, not just distancing himself from the act, but revealing the moment after. The moment where planning ends and reality begins. How long did you wait? I don't know. Again. Time fractured. Memory blurred. But the detail wasn't in the duration. It was in the hesitation. Because hesitation leaves traces.
Mistakes.
Did you clean anything? He shook his head.
No.
That matched the scene. No signs of cleanup. No attempt to erase. Because there hadn't been time. Or maybe there hadn't been a need. Did you take anything? He looked confused. Take. From the flat. A pause. Then.
No. No theft.
No motive in that direction. Which narrowed things again. Because if it wasn't about money, it was about something else. Something more controlled. More internal. They circled back. You said it wasn't supposed to escalate. He didn't respond immediately. Just stared at the ground. What was supposed to happen? Silence. Then. I just wanted to talk. The words felt thin. Incomplete. But they were offered.
Carefully.
Measured. And you needed restraints to talk? The detective asked. No response. Because the logic didn't hold. It never does. Not when control is involved. Not when fear is part of the design. You followed her, the detective continued. You watched her routine. You brought something to restrain her. That's not conversation.
He didn't argue, didn't defend, just stood there. Because deep down, the narrative he had built for himself was collapsing. Piece by piece.
Under the weight of reality. They shifted again. The second case. Do you remember another woman? His head tilted slightly. Same area.
Same time.
Disappeared. A pause.
Long.
Then.
No.
Too fast. Too clean. A denial that didn't match the pattern. Because patterns don't stop after one. Not like this. Not with preparation. Not with repetition. The detective stepped closer. Think carefully. Silence. You had access. You had time. You had method. Still nothing. But something in his posture changed. Tension.
Subtle.
But present. Did it happen more than once? The question hung. Heavy. Dangerous. Because this was the line. The one that separates a case from something much bigger. He exhaled slowly. Looked back at the excavation site. At the remains. At the truth uncovered in front of him. And for a moment, it seemed like he might answer. Like something deeper was about to surface. But then. He shook his head.
No.
The word landed flat. But it didn't settle. Because denial, at this stage, isn't certainty. It's resistance. And resistance means there's something still buried. Something not yet uncovered. The team didn't push further. Not here. Not now. Because they had what they needed for this moment. A location. A body. A connection. Enough to move forward. Enough to build a case. But not enough to close it. Not completely. As the remains were carefully lifted, secured, prepared for transport, the scene shifted again. From discovery to evidence. From past to present. Every fragment now carried forward into a system that would finally give it a voice. He watched it all.
Silent.
Unmoving. But something had changed. Because the past wasn't hidden anymore. It was out. Exposed. And once something is exposed, it doesn't go back. The vehicles prepared to leave. Equipment packed. Markers removed. The ground, disturbed, would never look the same again. Just like the case. Just like the story. And as they led him back toward the road, one thought settled in the minds of every detective present. This wasn't the end. Not even close. Because truth doesn't stop at one answer. It expands. It reveals. It demands more. And somewhere, buried deeper than soil, there were still pieces missing. Waiting. For their turn to surface. The site was sealed within hours, but the weight of what had been uncovered didn't stay in the ground. It followed them back, into the vehicles, into the reports, into the silence that settled over the team as London slowly reappeared around them. The city hadn't changed. Not really. Same traffic. Same noise. Same indifference. But something beneath it had shifted. A story long buried had begun to breathe again. Inside the forensic lab, the remains were processed with precision that didn't exist in 1975. Every fragment catalogued. Every measurement recorded. Bone, soil, trace elements, all mapped, analyzed, cross-referenced. The past, once silent, now spoke through data. Through patterns. Through things too small for the human eye to notice, but impossible for modern systems to ignore. The first confirmations came quickly. Female. Age range consistent. Time of burial aligned with winter conditions from late 1975. Environmental markers matched the area where the body was found. Nothing contradicted the narrative he had begun to reveal. But confirmation wasn't enough. They needed identity. Because until the remains were named, the case wasn't complete. It was just evidence. Dental records were pulled. Archived files reopened. Old X-rays compared against new scans. It took time, longer than anyone wanted, but eventually the match came back. Positive. After nearly 5 decades, the victim had her name returned. The room didn't react outwardly.
No celebración.
No relief. Just a quiet acknowledgement. Because identification doesn't bring someone back. It just restores what was taken. Detectives stood still for a moment, absorbing it. The case was no longer abstract. No longer a file with missing pieces. It was a person again. A life interrupted. A story that had waited too long to be told. They moved quickly after that. Next of kin. A process that never gets easier, no matter how many times it's done. But this one carried something different. Because they weren't just delivering news of loss, they were delivering closure that had been delayed for nearly half a century. The family had aged. Of course they had. Time doesn't pause for grief. It reshapes it, softens some edges, deepens others. But it never erases it. When detectives arrived, the reaction wasn't shock. Not entirely. It was something quieter. Heavier. Because part of them had always known. Or feared. Or suspected. But not knowing leaves space for hope. And hope, even fragile, can survive decades. Until it can't. The confirmation landed slowly,
carefully.
Words chosen with precision, but nothing could soften the truth. The remains had been found. Identified. The case reopened. A suspect in custody. Tears came, but not all at once. Not dramatic. Not overwhelming. Just steady.
Controlled.
The kind of grief that has learned to exist quietly over time. One question surfaced almost immediately. Was she alone? Detectives hesitated. Because the answer wasn't simple. Yes, they said. But even as they spoke it, something in the investigation suggested that might not be the whole truth. Back at the station, the focus shifted again. Interviews resumed. But the tone had changed. Before, it had been about opening him up. Now it was about breaking through what remained. Because he had given them enough to move forward, but not everything.
Not yet.
They brought him back into the room. Same table. Same walls. Same camera recording every second. But this time, the energy was different. He knew it. They knew it. Because now, they weren't asking what happened. They were asking what else happened. You said it was just her, the detective began. He nodded. Yes. But we've reviewed other cases. A pause. Other disappearances. Same time period. Same area. No reaction. Same pattern. Still nothing. But silence now wasn't control. It was pressure building. You had access. You had method. You had opportunity. The detective leaned forward. This doesn't happen once. He didn't respond. Didn't deny. Didn't confirm. Just sat. But his stillness wasn't the same as before. It was tighter. More rigid. As if holding something back required more effort now. We found fibers in another case, the detective continued. That wasn't entirely true.
Not yet.
But it didn't need to be. Because sometimes truth reveals itself when challenged. He blinked.
Once. Slow.
But enough. The detective saw it. Felt it. Pressed further. Same material. Same type. Silence. You were there too.
A breath. Subtle.
But real. We can prove it.
Not yet.
But close enough. The room tightened again. Because now the narrative wasn't just about one night. It was about a pattern. A possibility that stretched beyond what they had already uncovered. You said you didn't mean for it to escalate, the detective said. That means there was a plan. No response. What was the plan? A long pause. Then, to stop them, the words slipped out. Quiet. Unintended, but irreversible. To stop them, the detective repeated. He nodded. They moved too much. They made noise. Plural. Not singular. The room froze. Because that was it. The shift. From one victim to more. The detective didn't react immediately.
Didn't show it.
Just let the silence expand. Because once something like that is said, it echoes. And people hear it themselves. Realize what they've revealed. His expression changed.
Slightly.
As if he understood. Too late. You said them, the detective said calmly.
No accusation.
Just observation. He didn't answer.
Didn't correct.
Didn't deny. Because now. The silence said everything. The investigation widened instantly. Cold case files reopened. Patterns re-examined. Names resurfaced. Disappearances once considered unrelated now pulled into the same orbit. Because the possibility had changed. This wasn't just a single crime. It might be something much larger. Something that had gone unnoticed for decades. The team moved fast. Cross-referencing locations, timelines, reports. Looking for connections that had never been seen before. And slowly, they began to appear. Not clear. Not perfect. But there. Like shadows aligning under a single light. Back in the room, he sat in silence. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was different. Heavier. Because something had slipped. Something he hadn't meant to reveal. And now, it couldn't be taken back. The detective leaned in one last time. Voice low.
Steady.
How many? The question hung. Unavoidable. He didn't answer. Didn't move. Just stared at the table. Because some truths, even after 50 years, are harder to face than others. But the silence now was no longer protection. It was confirmation. And outside that room, the investigation was already expanding. Because what had started as a cold case was becoming something else entirely. Something darker. Something deeper. Something that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly half a century. The question remained unanswered. How many? 2 words. Simple.
Direct.
But inside that interview room, they carried the weight of decades. The suspect sat motionless, staring down at the table's surface. The same control posture. The same careful silence. But detectives had learned something important by then. Silence has different meanings. At the beginning, his silence had been confidence. A shield. A belief that time had protected him. 48 years had passed. Witnesses had disappeared. Records had faded. Memories had weakened. He believed the past was dead. But now the past was sitting across from him. And it was asking questions. The investigation changed direction overnight. What had started as a single reopened cold case became a much larger examination of forgotten disappearances across London. Files that had been closed decades earlier were pulled from storage. Boxes that had not been opened in years were placed on desks again. Names that had disappeared from newspapers returned to official reports. Because detectives were no longer asking, who is responsible for one crime? They were asking, how many lives were taken? The first step was rebuilding the timeline. The year everything began. Investigators created a map. Every disappearance, every suspicious report, every unresolved case involving women who vanished under strange circumstances. The map slowly filled with marks across London and surrounding areas. At first, nothing connected. Different neighborhoods, different circumstances, different police departments. That was why nobody had connected them before. Crimes are easier to see when you know what you're looking for. But back then, nobody knew. They were looking at individual tragedies, not a pattern. Then the similarities started appearing. The same absence of forced entry. The same late-night disappearances. The same lack of witnesses. The same strange detail. Women who seemed to vanish between ordinary moments, leaving behind homes, routines, belongings. Lives interrupted without explanation. The review team went deeper. They studied old interviews, old photographs, old handwritten notes from detectives who had since retired. And then they found something buried in one of the earliest reports. A witness statement. Almost forgotten. A woman who lived 2 streets away from the original crime scene. She had reported seeing a man walking through the area several nights before the disappearance. At the time, investigators dismissed it.
Why?
Because she couldn't identify him. No name. No face.
No proof. Just a feeling.
He looked like he knew where he was going, she had written. That sentence stopped the investigators. Because that was exactly the pattern they were seeing now. Not random movement. Not opportunity. Preparation. They returned to the suspect's background. For decades, he had appeared ordinary. That was what made him difficult to detect. No major criminal record. No public violence. No dramatic warning signs. He worked, paid bills, lived quietly. The type of person neighbors described with the same words every time. He kept to himself. He was polite. He seemed normal. Those words appeared again and again in cases involving hidden offenders. Because monsters rarely announce themselves. They disappear into normal life. They become part of the background. And that may have been his greatest advantage. Nobody was looking at him. Not until now. The forensic team expanded their examination. Old evidence was reviewed from other cases. Clothing, fibers, photographs, objects collected and stored decades earlier. Technology was giving forgotten evidence a second chance. And then another connection appeared. A small trace from another unsolved disappearance. A material fragment. Different location. Different year. But the same industrial composition. The same unusual nylon blend. The same material connected to the suspect's workplace. It wasn't enough by itself. But cold cases are rarely solved by one piece of evidence. They are solved by accumulation. One piece. Then another. Then another. Until coincidence becomes impossible. The detectives returned to the interview room. This time, they carried photographs. Not of crime scenes. Of victims. Because statistics are easy to ignore. Faces are not. They placed them one by one on the table. Names. Ages.
Lives.
People who had families. People who had plans. People who expected tomorrow to arrive. The suspect looked at them. And for the first time, his expression changed. Not dramatically. Not enough for someone watching casually. But enough for detectives who had spent hours studying every movement. Recognition. That was the word. Recognition. You know these women, the detective said.
No.
The answer came quickly. Too quickly. You recognize them.
No.
You remember them. Silence. And again, silence became the answer. The detective leaned forward. You spent decades believing nobody would connect these cases. No response. You believed every missing person was a separate tragedy. Still nothing. But they weren't. A pause. They were connected. His eyes moved. Only slightly. But they moved.
And that was enough.
The detectives continued. They talked about the first victim. Then the others. They described the years of uncertainty. Families waiting. Questions unanswered. Rooms left untouched. Photographs left on shelves. Because every cold case is more than an investigation. It is a family frozen in time. A person missing. A future stolen. The suspect listened. And for a moment, the room felt different. Not like an interrogation. Like a confrontation with history. You remember everything, the detective said. A long pause. Then, I remember some things. The answer was quiet, but powerful, because it was the first time he moved away from denial. You remember some things? Yes. What do you remember? He looked away. The nights. The room went still. What about the nights? Silence. Then, the waiting. A chill moved through the room. Because that word revealed something important. Waiting. Not reacting. Not accidental. Waiting. Planning. Watching. The detective asked carefully. You watched them before you approached? No answer. But no denial. You followed routines? Silence. You learned where they went. His breathing changed. Only slightly. But enough. Because now the investigation was no longer built around one moment. It was built around a process. A method. A repeated behavior. The suspect had not simply encountered victims. He had selected them. And that realization changed everything. Outside the interview room, analysts continued building the timeline. More files arrived. More names. More unanswered questions. The number kept growing.
3, 4, 5.
Possibly more. The city that believed it had buried one terrible event was beginning to understand something far worse. The cold case had never been cold. It had been waiting. Waiting for technology. Waiting for evidence. Waiting for someone to look again. And now, after 48 years, the forgotten details were speaking. The fiber. The reports. The patterns. The silence. Everything was leading back to one man. But the most disturbing question remained unanswered. Not how he did it. Not why he chose them. But how many times he had done it before someone finally stopped him. And as detectives continued searching through decades of forgotten files, they discovered something that sent a new shock through the investigation.
A name.
A disappearance. A case that had been sitting unnoticed for years. And the details were almost identical. The same city. The same method. The same signature. The same invisible trail. The trail that had finally led them to him. The new file arrived just after midnight. A thin folder. Faded cover. A name written across the front in black ink that had lost its sharpness after decades of storage. It was the kind of document that usually disappeared into history. Another unresolved disappearance. Another family left waiting. Another investigation that had slowly been buried beneath newer crimes and louder headlines. But this time, detectives opened it differently. They were no longer searching randomly. They were looking for a pattern. And patterns reveal what isolated cases hide. The victim was 26 years old. Missing in 1977. 2 years after the first confirmed case. Different neighborhood. Different circumstances. At least, that was what investigators believed at the time. The original report described a woman who failed to return home after an evening shift. Her apartment was found locked. No signs of violence. No broken windows.
No había struggle.
The investigation lasted months before slowly fading into silence. A familiar story. Too familiar. The review team placed the file beside the others. The first thing they noticed was the timeline. The suspect had lived in the same general area. The suspect had worked the same type of night schedule. The suspect had access to the same industrial materials. But coincidence alone was not enough. They needed more. They needed something connecting him directly. So they returned to the evidence. Not the conclusions. The evidence. Because old investigations often fail, for one reason. They stop asking questions too early. Inside the 1977 file were photographs. A bedroom. A hallway. A small personal space frozen in time. And then they saw it. A detail that had been ignored. A small mark near the entrance. A pattern in the dust. Similar to the original crime scene. Not identical. But close. Too close. The detectives compared photographs from both locations. Different years.
Different investigators.
Different assumptions. Yet the same feeling remained. Someone had entered. Someone who was not forcing their way inside. Someone who had control. The theory changed again.
This was not a stranger attack.
This was someone who knew how to approach. How to wait. How to disappear. The suspect was brought back for another interview. This time, the atmosphere was different.
He knew they had found something.
Before, he had been reacting to questions. Now, he was reacting to discoveries. The detective placed the 1977 photograph on the table.
No explanation. No accusation.
Just the image. The suspect looked at it. And for several seconds, nothing happened. Then his eyes moved away. A small movement. Almost invisible. But after hours of observation, detectives understood what it meant. Recognition. You know this place, the detective said.
No.
You recognize it.
No.
Then why did you look away? Silence. The question remained unanswered. The detective continued. She disappeared 2 years after the first victim. No response. Same city. Silence. Same method. His expression tightened.
Barely.
But it tightened. You were there.
No.
You were nearby.
No. You knew about this. The suspect leaned back slightly. A defensive movement. The first clear sign of discomfort. Because the investigation had changed. They were no longer asking him to explain the past. They were forcing the past to explain him. The detectives continued through the timeline. Then, another case. A woman missing after leaving a restaurant. No body recovered.
No suspect. No closure.
At the time, investigators believed she may have left voluntarily. That theory lasted for decades.
Until now.
The old report mentioned one strange detail. A witness saw a dark-colored sedan parked near the location. The driver was described as a man sitting alone. Watching. Waiting. The witness never saw the face. The description was too vague. The lead was abandoned. But now it mattered. Because during the search of the suspect's old employment records, detectives discovered something else. A vehicle. Registered during the exact period of the disappearance.
Dark sedan. Same model family.
Same location range. Another coincidence. Another thread. Another piece. The suspect's defense would later argue that old memories create false connections. That investigators were forcing unrelated events into one story because they wanted an answer. And that argument had power. Because cold cases are dangerous. They are built on fragments. On shadows. On things that survived when everything else disappeared. But this investigation wasn't built on one clue. It was built on dozens. The detectives returned to the interview. You understand what we are looking at now. The suspect remained silent. Not one woman. Silence. Not one night. Silence. A pattern. His eyes lowered. And then unexpectedly he spoke. You don't know everything. The room stopped. Because it was not denial. It was not anger. It was something else. A warning. The detective leaned forward. What don't we know? The suspect didn't answer. What are you saying? Another pause. Then. You found the ones you could find. The words were quiet. But they changed the entire investigation. Because suddenly, the possibility became larger. Much larger. The team reviewed everything again. Every disappearance. Every unresolved case. Every report involving a similar timeline. The number expanded. And with every new file, the same disturbing question returned. How many? The suspect had spent nearly 5 decades believing time was on his side. But time had done the opposite. It preserved things. It stored details. It kept evidence alive until technology caught up. The fiber that meant nothing in 1975. The reports nobody connected. The witnesses nobody believed. The files nobody reopened. They all survived. Waiting. The investigation moved beyond London. Because some names appeared in neighboring regions. Some disappearances followed the same pattern. Women leaving work late. Women walking alone. Women whose routines became predictable. And someone who seemed to understand those routines. The detectives examined travel records. Employment history. Old addresses. The suspect had moved several times. Not dramatically. Not enough to attract attention. But always just enough. New neighborhood.
New job.
New routine. A reset. And then another disappearance. The pattern was no longer just criminal. It was geographic. He moved.
cases appeared. He disappeared into normal life again. The realization sent a shock through the investigation team. Because they had not caught him after one mistake. They had caught him after decades of survival. The arrest that shocked the community was now becoming something much larger. A forgotten evidence trail had not just solved one cold case. It had opened a door into years of unanswered questions. And behind that door were more victims, more families, more stories waiting to be heard. But the most disturbing discovery came from a review of the suspect's personal belongings after his arrest. A small notebook.
Old. Worn.
Hidden away. At first glance, it looked meaningless. Random dates. Short notes. Numbers. Locations. But when investigators began comparing the entries, their blood ran cold. Because some of those dates matched disappearances that had never been solved. And suddenly, the investigation had entered a new phase. The evidence was no longer buried underground. It was sitting in his own handwriting, waiting to tell the story he had spent 48 years trying to hide. The notebook changed everything. For nearly 50 years, investigators had been searching through missing pieces, a forgotten fiber, an overlooked witness statement, a photograph that carried more questions than answers. Every clue had existed separately, trapped inside different files, different years, different departments. But now they were connected. Not by theory. Not by assumption.
By ink. By dates.
By handwriting. The small notebook recovered from the suspect's belongings became the center of the investigation. At first, it appeared meaningless. A worn object among many others. The kind of personal item people keep without anyone ever asking why. The pages were yellowed. The cover was damaged. The writing was faded in places, almost disappearing into the paper. But when forensic analysts examined it, they realized something disturbing. The notebook had been maintained for years. Not randomly. Not casually.
Carefully.
The first pages contained ordinary information, expenses, work schedules, addresses.
Notes about daily life.
Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. Then the entries changed.
Dates. Times.
Locations. Short phrases. No names.
No explanations.
Just fragments. A system only one person understood. Investigators began building a timeline. Slowly. Methodically. Every entry was compared against unresolved cases from the same period. At first, there were only 2 matches. Then 4. Then more. The room became quieter with every connection. Because the possibility they had been afraid of was becoming reality. The notebook was not a diary. It was a record. A record of moments that someone believed would never be discovered. The first confirmed match was linked to a disappearance from the late 1970s. A woman whose case had remained open for decades. The original investigation had ended without answers. Her family had spent years searching for information that never came. Now, a single date written in an old notebook placed her disappearance in a new light. The entry did not contain a confession. It did not describe what happened. But it placed him there. Near the location. On the exact night. Within the exact time frame. The defense would later argue that dates alone prove nothing. And, technically, they were right. A date is only a date. A location is only a location. But when dozens of dates become a pattern, when dozens of locations become a map, when dozens of coincidences point in the same direction, the picture changes. The detectives returned to the suspect. This time, they didn't bring photographs. They didn't bring crime scene images. They brought the notebook, placed it on the table, and waited. For several seconds, he stared at it.
No surprise. No confusión.
Just recognition. You know what this is, the detective said. A pause.
No.
The answer came slower than before. You kept records.
No.
Then explain the dates. Silence. Explain the locations. Silence. Explain why these entries match missing persons cases. His expression remained controlled. But control was becoming harder. Because the notebook represented something he could not dismiss. Witnesses could be wrong. Memories could fade. Technology could be questioned. But his own handwriting was different. It belonged to him. The detective opened the notebook carefully. Turned pages one by one. You wrote these. No response. You were tracking something. Still nothing. Were you tracking them? The question remained unanswered. But the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of someone hiding information. It was the silence of someone realizing there was nowhere left to hide. The investigation expanded again. Experts analyzed every page. Ink samples. Writing pressure. Timeline consistency. Even the order of entries. And then they discovered something even more disturbing. Some entries appeared to have been written before the disappearances were publicly reported. That detail sent shockwaves through the investigation. Because it suggested planning. Knowledge. Preparation. Not reaction. Not memory. Preparation. The suspect had not been documenting events afterward. He had been recording them as they happened. The question became unavoidable.
Why?
Why keep evidence that could destroy him? Psychologists studying similar offenders often describe a dangerous contradiction: the desire to hide and the desire to preserve. The need to erase the crime while secretly maintaining control over the memory of it. The notebook was not just information. It was possession. A private world where he controlled the story. Where victims became entries. Where lives became dates. Where tragedies became reminders. Investigators searched deeper into his background. They found more hidden material. Old maps. Newspaper clippings. Articles about missing persons. Not a collection someone accidentally creates. A collection built over time. The community reacted with shock as details began to emerge. Neighbors who had once described him as quiet and ordinary struggled to understand. How could someone living among them carry such secrets? How could someone attend work, buy groceries, exchange polite greetings? While investigators now believed he was connected to years of unanswered questions. The answer was uncomfortable. Because the most frightening offenders are often not the ones people expect. They are not always dramatic. They do not always attract attention. Sometimes they disappear into routine. They become familiar. They become invisible. And invisibility can last for decades. The media attention exploded. A forgotten cold case had become a national story. Headlines changed daily. Cold case reopened after decades. Hidden evidence reveals shocking connection. Forgotten notebook unlocks mystery. But behind the headlines were families. Families who had spent years without answers. Families now wondering whether their own cases might finally be revisited. The investigation hotline received hundreds of messages. Old reports. New memories. People who had never spoken before came forward. Some because they remembered something strange. some because they recognized details, and some because they had carried questions for years. Every message had to be examined. Every claim had to be verified. Because investigators knew something important. Finding connections is easy. Proving them is not. The suspect's legal team challenged everything. They argued the notebook was being misunderstood. They argued the entries were ambiguous. They argued investigators were building a story around coincidence. And that became the next battle. Not finding suspicion, but proving guilt. The prosecution needed more than patterns. They needed evidence that could survive in court. So detectives returned to the original cases. The physical evidence. The witness statements. The forensic links. Everything was reviewed again. And slowly, another discovery emerged. A handwriting comparison revealed that several notes from old evidence files matched the same writing style found in the notebook. Notes that investigators had never connected before. Small annotations. Private reminders. Information written in places where nobody thought to look. The suspect had left traces throughout the years. Not obvious ones. Not dramatic ones. But enough. Enough to build a bridge between the past and the present. The case had started with one unanswered disappearance. Then one piece of forgotten evidence. Then one arrest. Now it had become something far larger. A window into decades of silence. But even as investigators prepared their final case, one question continued to haunt them. The notebook contained dozens of entries. Dozens of dates. Dozens of locations. But investigators had only identified some of them. Which meant there were still pages they could not explain. Places they had not searched. Names they had not found. And possibly victims whose stories had never been told. The suspect had spent 48 years believing the truth would remain buried. But the notebook proved something different. The truth was never gone. It was waiting. Waiting for someone to look closer. Waiting for someone to ask the right questions. And now, every page was leading investigators toward the final mystery. How many lives had been hidden inside those pages? And how many families were still waiting for an answer? El eco lejano de aquel frío invierno de 1975 continúa resonando como una advertencia perpetua y fantasmal en los callejones empedrados y brumosos del East End de Londres, recordándonos con implacable dureza que el tiempo, por muy vasto, piadoso o cómplice que parezca con los criminales que logran evadir la ley, nunca es un escudo definitivo contra la implacable maquinaria de la verdad histórica. A medida que las manecillas del reloj avanzan hacia el futuro y las nuevas generaciones de investigadores incorporan tecnologías de análisis genético de última generación a sus rutinas diarias, el caso que mantuvo en vilo a la capital británica durante casi medio siglo permanece grabado en la memoria colectiva no solo como un triunfo técnico de la ciencia forense moderna, sino como una lección magistral sobre la resiliencia humana, la memoria institucional y el peso insoportable de una conciencia culpable que termina por fracturar hasta al más astuto de los mentirosos. A lo largo de estas últimas décadas, la evolución de la criminología ha demostrado de manera categórica que los crímenes perfectos no existen en la realidad. Lo que realmente existen son investigaciones limitadas por las barreras tecnológicas de su época. Pistas descartadas prematuramente por el cansancio de los agentes y la arrogancia ciega de asesinos que confunden el silencio temporal de los expedientes archivados con su total y definitiva absolución ante los ojos de la historia. El hombre que durante 49 años caminó libremente por las calles del Reino Unido, que abrazó a sus hijos, construyó una reputación respetable, pagó sus impuestos con puntualidad británica y durmió con la falsa y cómoda tranquilidad de haber burlado al sistema. Representa la encarnación misma de esa dualidad profundamente perturbadora que habita en los rincones más oscuros de la psique humana, la capacidad casi sobrenatural de compartimentalizar el horror más absoluto. De enterrar un cadáver metafórico bajo capas impenetrables de una normalidad meticulosamente fingida y sonrisas calculadas al milímetro frente al espejo de la cotidianidad. Sin embargo, la naturaleza humana, Por más entrenada y disciplinada que esté en el arte milenario del engaño y la simulación, siempre deja pequeñas fisuras. Microgrietas invisibles a simple vista pero perfectamente detectables cuando la luz incisiva de la ciencia contemporánea ilumina los rincones polvorientos del pasado con una potencia descomunal. Aquella madrugada de 1975, cuando las luces parpadeantes de una ciudad sepultada bajo la niebla sulfurosa fueron testigos mudos de una vida arrebatada con fría precisión. Se encendió una chispa de misterio que ni el paso implacable de las estaciones, ni la destrucción de los antiguos archivos de papel, ni la distancia geográfica pudieron apagar jamás. Los familiares de la víctima, aquellos que sostuvieron la frágil antorcha de la esperanza cuando todas las puertas institucionales se cerraban herméticamente en sus rostros, experimentaron un vía crucis emocional y psicológico que desafía los límites de la resistencia humana. Cada aniversario luctuoso, cada silla vacía en las reuniones familiares, cada llamada telefónica anónima que prometía pistas falsas y solo entregaba desesperación, se fue acumulando como capas de plomo en sus almas, transformando el dolor agudo y punzante de la pérdida inicial en una pena sorda, constante y devastadora que se convirtió en su segunda piel a lo largo de décadas de silenciosa agonía. Y es precisamente en ese punto crítico donde radica la verdadera dimensión trágica y a la vez profundamente redentora de este expediente, en la constatación innegable de que la justicia no es simplemente un mecanismo frío compuesto por códigos penales, magistrados con pelucas tradicionales, celdas de máxima seguridad y barrotes de acero, sino un compromiso moral profundamente humano, una promesa solemne susurrada en la oscuridad entre un investigador apesadumbrado y una familia destrozada por el dolor. Un pacto invisible que dictamina que mientras exista un solo hilo microscópico de evidencia por analizar, una sola muestra genética preservada en el frío almacenamiento o un solo sospechoso respirando en libertad, la búsqueda de la verdad no se detendrá jamás, por muchos años, décadas o siglos que deban transcurrir en el intento desesperado por devolverle la dignidad a los caídos. La caída estrepitosa del fugitivo, acorralado en su apacible refugio costero a cientos de kilómetros de la escena original del crimen, sacudió los cimientos de la seguridad ciudadana. Y reavivó en todo el territorio británico un debate ético tan antiguo como la civilización misma. ¿Hasta qué punto estamos verdaderamente seguros en nuestras rutinas diarias? ¿Cuántos depredadores silenciosos caminan entre nosotros disfrazados de amables ancianos o ciudadanos ejemplares? ¿Cuántos secretos macabros duermen plácidamente bajo la superficie pulida de nuestras sociedades modernas esperando el instante preciso en que la ciencia decida revelar sus verdaderas identidades al mundo? La respuesta, aunque profundamente aterradora y perturbadora para el ciudadano común, es precisamente la fuerza motriz que mantiene en marcha la maquinaria incansable de las unidades de casos fríos. Nos recuerda una y otra vez que ningún monstruo es completamente invulnerable al paso del tiempo y que la impunidad, por más longeva, sofisticada y bien protegida que parezca, siempre lleva consigo una fecha de caducidad ineludible grabada con fuego en el destino. Los analistas criminales y psicólogos forenses que estudiaron minuciosamente el caso tras el arresto coinciden plenamente en señalar que el momento exacto en que el sospechoso vio cruzar el umbral de su puerta a los agentes armados no fue más que la culminación lógica y matemática de una trampa perfecta, una ecuación implacable donde cada variable olvidada, desde el ADN diminuto rescatado en el tejido de un abrigo viejo hasta los testimonios tardíos de vecinos que finalmente decidieron romper su pacto de silencio, se alinearon con la precisión milimétrica de un reloj suizo que nunca falla. Ya no existían coartadas defensivas posibles, ya no servían los nombres falsos ni las mudanzas estratégicas a través de diferentes condados, la firma biológica invisible que dejó grabada de manera permanente en el tejido mismo de la historia criminal lo condenó de por vida, transformándolo en un instante de respetable jubilado a recluso número en los registros penitenciarios federales de máxima seguridad. La cobertura mediática masiva e implacable que acompañó cada etapa del proceso judicial posterior funcionó como una catarsis colectiva sin precedentes, un espejo gigantesco donde la sociedad británica pudo contemplar tanto lo peor de su propia naturaleza, la capacidad aberrante de infligir un daño gratuito y sádico por motivos triviales, como lo mejor de su persistencia histórica, la negativa absoluta a permitir que el olvido y la indiferencia se convirtieran en los cómplices definitivos del asesino en la sombra. Las calles de aquel distrito londinense donde todo comenzó hace ya casi medio siglo han recuperado oficialmente su ritmo habitual, los turistas continúan transitando por los antiguos callejones bajo la lluvia o la niebla sin sospechar jamás los horrores macabros que presenciaron esos mismos adoquines en el pasado, y la vida urbana sigue su curso inexorable hacia adelante. Sin embargo, para cualquiera que conozca a fondo las entrañas de este expediente histórico, el paisaje urbano ya nunca volverá a ser el mismo. Cada esquina oscura, cada reflejo de las luces de la calle sobre el asfalto mojado, Y cada mención a los archivos perdidos de los años 70 evocarán instantáneamente el fantasma imborrable de aquel misterio impenetrable que desafió con soberbia al tiempo y a las instituciones durante generaciones enteras. Es la fascinación eterna y morbosa por el verdadero género criminal, la pulsión visceral que nos empuja a mirar fijamente hacia los abismos más profundos de la perversidad humana para comprender mejor nuestras propias vulnerabilidades y, al mismo tiempo, reafirmar una fe inquebrantable en que, tarde o temprano, la luz de la verdad siempre termina por devorar a la sombra más densa y prolongada. El expediente se archiva de manera formal y definitiva con el sello rojo de impreso resolutorio. Las firmas de los fiscales quedan estampadas en la última página del documento oficial, y el bullicio de la prensa se desvanece lentamente en el aire frío de la tarde para dar paso al silencio solemne de la justicia cumplida. Pero el eco lejano de aquel grito ahogado en 1975 continuará flotando como una advertencia perpetua en el ambiente denso de la metrópolis, recordándonos solemnemente que, aunque el mal puede disfrazarse con maestría de respetabilidad y escapar durante décadas a lomos de la impunidad más absoluta, el pasado siempre guarda cuentas pendientes, y la justicia, con su paso paciente pero absolutamente inexorable, siempre acaba cobrándoselas hasta el último centavo, cerrando para siempre el círculo de la pesadilla y devolviendo al fin la paz largamente anhelada a quienes nunca, ni por un solo segundo, perdieron la fe en el milagro de la verdad revelada.